Welcome everyone to the last research session of our conference by Kwame Odame, and he's doing his PhD in geography and regional planning at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And in his research, he focuses on the needs of disabled commuters in Accra, and he used MAXDAYS to analyze his data. So we're excited to see how you implemented it and look forward to your presentation, Kwame. The stage is yours.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon from Ghana. My name is Kwame Odame, and I'm a PhD student. And so I'm presenting on the topic, travel mode choice and its responsiveness to the needs of commuters with disability. For context, this study was born out of years of interaction with the disability community as a volunteer and also as an active member of various NGOs who engage with members of Ghana's disability population for various activities. So we want to look at it from that angle, focusing on transport issues exclusively. You see, access to transport services are very crucial, particularly for low-income groups. Transport services connect us to schools, hospitals, nightclubs, and even religious places. But regardless of the reason why different people would want to travel, the literature indicates that not everyone in the general population encounters the same level of ease when traveling. And so there is always the issue of inequality when it comes to access of transport services. But you see, regardless of the various population group, persons with disability have always been prominent when discussions of inequality in access comes into being. And one of the key reasons why the PWD communities have always been prominent is the fact that they currently constitute about 15% of the globe's population, making them the world's largest minority group. So with reference to the minority population, they are quite on the high. And so if we scale this number down with reference to proportion, Ghana's disability population, on the other hand, reveals that persons with disability are about 3% of Ghana's population, but there have always been arguments on this number as other researchers have bumped the number up to somewhere between 10 to 15%. With persons with disability being represented among the poverty bracket, what it means is that ownership of private cars as a means of traveling from one point to the other is either non-existent or very difficult to come by. And for that matter, public transport services always becomes the most viable options for PWDs to journey from point A to point B for many reasons. The fact that they are cheaper, the fact that they have wider coverage from the length and breadth of Ghana, and the fact that they are also easily accessible. But regardless of the reasons why someone would engage a public transport mode, Goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals states that these public transport services should be inclusive enough and should be of a kind that recognizes the needs of PWDs. And it is in this regard that this study of mine, this is just a part of the study, looks at or explores the responsiveness of our public transport services to the needs of persons with disability using the Accra Metropolitan Assembly as the focus of discussion. And so why transport, especially when some may perceive to have more critical and more serious issues when it comes to addressing the general welfare of persons with disability? If you look at the proliferation of literature on PWD's life in Ghana, you realize that there's kind of been an overly concentration of responsiveness with reference to particular places. So there are researchers looking at how educational facilities meet the needs of PWDs, how shopping centers, hotels, hospitals, and other buildings meet the needs of PWDs. But I always ask this question, of what benefit will these facilities be if the transport services connecting them from their homes to these facilities are in a deplorable condition or are not necessarily responsive enough to their needs? What it means is that if we take away the transport services, then perhaps we may only paint a partial picture of the living situations of PWDs. And for that matter, there is always the need to look at transport issues with regards to the lives of PWDs. Let's not forget that disability is part of human diversity. And for that matter, we have the responsibility of ensuring that persons with disability live the same life to the same extent as other members of society without disability. So with the aim of looking at the issue of access, and inequality in usage. The study largely explored, adopted an exploratory research design simply because this formed part of the very few foundational studies to look at critical issues relating to accessibility and extent of usage of public transport services. And so, with the hope of raising awareness and amplifying the voices of PWDs, the study resulted in a qualitative study to give us the opportunity to listen to their concerns, issues, and opinions when it comes to the responsiveness of our transport services to their needs. And for that matter, the Accra Metropolitan Assembly was specifically chosen. One of the reasons being that the AMA situates Ghana's national capital city of Accra. And for that matter, most of activities relating to the disability community have been known to be very represented within this particular enclave. What it means is that if we are able to bring attention to the needs in the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, we are most likely to bring attention to the needs of other satellite communities within Ghana. And so AMA was selectively chosen to be the study area, as seen in the image to my right. And so, which group of disability population were selected for the study? I chose two groups, the visually impaired and the physically impaired, for one reason. If you look at Ghana's disability structure, you realize that these two population groups actually constitute about 65% of Ghana's disability population. They are virtually combined in the majority. And the literature further instigates that if we are able to meet the needs of these two groups, we are invariably meeting the needs of other smaller minority groups within the disability population, i.e., those with hearing impairments and those with other forms of disability. So, to give clarity, opinion, visibility to the members of the disability community, the primary instrument adopted here was an interview guide, preferably the semi-structured interview guide, necessarily to give us a general flexibility in the data collection and allow myself and my participants to also have the freedom to elicit responses and interact in a more natural way. Then I also adopted an interview guide, which was more or less an observational checklist necessary to also ascertain whether or not our public transport services offers some specific disability-friendly facilities as stipulated in our Ghana Disability Act. So, do our transport services make room for priority seats? I had to observe that. Do we make room for designated places for wheelchair users? I had to observe that. Do we also ensure we have adaptive technology on board that meets their needs? These were things that were observed as part of the auditing scheme to augment the narratives given by members of the disability community. So the transcripts from the interview sessions were certainly transcribed. And unfortunately, existing transcription services did not give room for me simply because they don't accommodate the local Ghanaian dialects which were used in the interview sessions. So I actually had to transcribe them verbatim using the MAXDAYS program as a way of not only familiarizing myself with the data, but also reliving the experiences of participants as they share their account of how our current transport services respond to their needs. Largely, two key analytical tools in MAXDAYS were used. That was the code map, which gave us a visual impression of issues relating to their mode choice, and the code metrics browser, which also gave us the distributions of code relating to the various disability groups and the issues that were inherent in their discussion. So this slide gives us a general overview of the various data collection mode that was engaged. I must say that this study was highly participatory, making sure that the members of the disability community found themselves and also identified themselves as active participants or co-authors in the project and not necessarily as research test subjects that were merely needed for information and later be discarded. So the outreach of the Ghana Blind Union was primarily used, and that of the Ghana Society of the Physically Challenged. And as part of that, I had to engage in the daily living situation, which required about 2 months of constant interaction with members of the disability population. So if you look to the extreme right, the gentleman in the wheelchair smiling is myself, and behind me are wheelchair users who are engaging in basketball activities. Right on top of me are also wheelchair users who are also engaging in mini golf tournaments organized by some NGOs. And this formed part of a critical bonding process that allowed participants to open up and also get more interested in the study. These are the findings of the study, having gone through all of these things. I admit that the choice of public transport services comes in various diversity and modes, particularly in Accra, as it could either manifest in shared taxi services or minivans or even Uber services as given by the definition of public transport services. From the data, one particular travel mode was clear and as preferred to the PWDs. And so if you look at the code map, judging by the thickness of the lines, we realize that trotro services became the most preferred means of public transport services to these two participants. And the fact that they selected trotro services means that there were key factors that actually pull them to these services. And when you talk of trotro services, we simply refers to minivans that had a seating capacity to somewhere between 12 to 27. And one of the key things that drew them to these minivans was the fact that they were virtually the cheapest of all transport services available in Accra. And when I say cheaper, I mean transport services that could require somewhere between 20 cents to 50 cents to actually visit a facility like a hospital and actually return. So these were largely critical factors that were pulling them. But you see, beyond economic reasons, the trotro or the minivans environment also offered critical reasons that allowed them to draw closer to this facility beyond that. And one of the reasons was a sense of community and social engagement that was enjoyed within these minivans. And so to PWDs, it is within these minivans that they get to observe, interact with many low-income and middle-income group, and also interact and discuss a whole range of issues relating to politics, sports, argument on various social topics that were of interest to them. These social engagements allow them to not only expand their social network of people and friends they had, but also get familiar with other aspects of life issues that were not necessarily within their terrain. And the third reason that actually pulled them towards these structural or minivans that were not inherent in shared taxi services or even Uber services was a perceived sense of personal security associated with traveling from point A to point B. And personal security in the sense that PWDs felt that the presence of many eyes, and we are looking at 12 to somewhere around 27 people on a bus, the presence of many eyes and bodies actually deterred potential thieves and armed robbers from actually targeting them as victims, or even prevented them from being used as bait for ritual murders, which were quite high within the time of the study, though none of the study identified as even coming close to being kidnapped for ritual murder. But these were common expressions and concerns that actually pulled them to the trotro services as key factors that made them enjoy them as compared to enjoying taxi services or the Uber services. But you see, choosing trotro services was one key thing. The next key thing was to identify critical concerns of PWDs in enjoying these services. And to identify these critical concerns, the code metrics browser was used to critically identify some of the key issues that were identified to influence PWD's ability to enjoy this particular mode of transport. And so if you look at the code metrics browser, you identify that attitude of transport operators was identified to be the biggest influencer of PWD's ability to enjoy our transport services, followed by other variables like wayfinding aids, the comfort or the interior designs of vehicle, as well as the presence of priority seats. And I'll take time to go through some of these key issues just to give us a general overview of the extent to which these facilities, their presence or otherwise, actually influences the ability to enjoy this service, and also give us a general overview on the extent to which our transport services are inclusive to their needs. So let's start off with the presence of priority seats. Let me say that priority seats are categorically cited in our Disability Act, and I'm looking at the Ghana's Disability Act. And in the Disability Act, it clearly stipulates that all public transport services should make room for PWDs by offering 2 seats. However, the findings of the auditing scheme did not give any indication of any priority seat on any of the buses that were inspected during the data collection exercise. So what it means is that PWDs had no provision, they had no support services when it comes to priority seats. And for that matter, they actually had to sit anywhere they want to sit, so long as there is an available seat available to them. And so if you look at the anonymous quotation that was attached to this particular site, it tells you one thing: the only place available to them was anywhere, implying they only get to sit on any seat as long as the seat is available to them. But on the other side, participants also made it clear that indeed there are no seats available for them when it comes to designation. However, they have also identified specific places they thought was ideal for them to sit, simply because it reduces the number of steps they virtually have to take in navigating around in a bus, and also reduce the amount of time that will require to either join or alight. And these seats were seats that were either close to the driver, as seen in the yellow arrow, or the seats that were directly behind the driver. Unfortunately, these preferred seats by members of the disability community were also seats that were preferred by the general population. So they again tend to compete with the general population for these seats, and there were very little provision from the transport operators to even go out of their way to reserve these seats for PWDs, knowing very well their travel needs may certainly not be the same as other population groups. Then quickly followed up is the comfort of PWDs when they actually hop or try to enter or exit these buses. And when you talk of comfort, I am specifically looking at the floor height of these vehicles, which simply refers to the vertical distance from the ground and the first level of entry into these buses. By standard, the United Nations and Ghana Disability Act indicates that a minimum height of 250 millimeters was enough to allow PWDs to seemingly and independently hop on and exit from transport services within Ghana. However, observed height of all vehicles examined in the field revealed a range of somewhere between 320 to 520 millimeters, which were far in excess of the recommended standard for PWDs. And so if you see the image attached to that, you could tell a typical image of a vehicle that went beyond the recommended height. And this was typical of vehicles like the Mercedes-Benz 207 Sprinter buses and some retrofitted Toyota Haze, Hyundai Grace, and other buses. I must say that the high floor height of this bus did not appear to be a challenge for the visually impaired, for many reasons, being that they were actually accustomed with this high floor height, as seen in their experiences in using the same buses virtually everywhere they go. However, the physically challenged were the most affected of all PWDs, as this height actually made it difficult for them to independently propel themselves from the ground onto the vehicle and back. So how do they get on board? The only way they could get on board was to either crawl or be physically lifted by the transport operator, as seen in the diagram I have attached. These two things were most practiced simply because none of the transport terminals visited in the field had any ramps that would have even made it difficult for PWDs to actually move from the ground onto the vehicle and back, and also make their journeys easier. So in their daily living experience, this became key part of the things, the issue of being lifted, crawling, and etc. But I must say that while these things were being done, participants also identified some implications and admitted that this is all that is available to them. But though they had no option than to endure them, they found these crude approaches to be very embarrassing to them and also dehumanizing, because none of the people in the general population get to witness all of these things being lifted, crawling. And so it drew unnecessary attention to them and even shattered their confidence in interacting with other passengers on board, or even identifying themselves as valuable members of the community. Quickly followed with that are the presence of wayfinding aids. And if you go back to the previous slides, the high floor height and the presence of ramps were specifically related to the physically challenged, i.e. the wheelchair users and others. But when it comes to the presence of wayfinding aids, they were also crucial to the visually impaired, because these wayfinding aids were necessary to give them a general appreciation of their physical environment, to have basic information like where they have gotten to as part of the journey process, and how they will use that information to also project their next trip destination or even communicate with transport operators. Let me say that the auditing exercise that was gathered in the field revealed the total absence of any wayfinding aids that would have made it easier for PWDs, particularly the visually impaired, to have a sense of their physical environment and also make independent decisions. What happens is that visually impaired participants in the study constantly had to rely on other passengers or other commuters in order for them to identify their way or know where they have gotten to. From the study, some of the key wayfinding aids that were identified from the field relates to their constant reliance on the mate, which some people refer as the conductors, the use of local knowledge, reliance on some mobile technology available to them, or their reliance on other passengers who would help them to ascertain where they have gotten to and also make their future projections. Let me say that the code metric browser was employed here to just give us a general overview of key wayfinding aids that were adopted by participants in order for them to ascertain basic travel decisions along the route. But whilst most participants identified their reliance on conductors as a way to ascertain where they have gotten to, I want to say that these call outs by the conductors were not necessarily done to aid PWDs in their travel trips. No, they were done primarily as a way to draw the attention of prospective passengers to get on board. And so once they have gotten enough passengers or the vehicle was full, the call out by the conductors was considerably reduced to the barest minimum. So once the vehicle gets full, visually impaired participants do not get the opportunity of hearing constant call out by these conductors. And the second reason associated with this dependence was the fact that anytime these conductors either forget or get disrupted from their activities, this necessarily also relates to the fact that PWDs may end up in different locations or end up missing their destination. And unfortunately, our transport services is not in a way that may give remedial services for the visually impaired to find their way back to their destination if they miss their destination through any of these approaches. The second approach through which PWDs conveniently find their way or their direction was a heavy reliance on past experiences or local knowledge. So they were able to use muscle memory to identify where they have gotten to using key landmarks like the roughness of the road, peculiar sound or stench in specific geographical areas, the number of speed ramps, the twists and turns the vehicle will make whilst it gets to specific locations, and etc. And for them, these past experiences or local knowledge or personal intuitions also have critical limitations because once they are able to miss specific calculations or have some interruptions in their memory or their senses, they always find themselves in different destinations. Hence, the need for basic technology to also augment their physical abilities in order for them to travel like the general population. Surprisingly, the disability-friendly mobile technology was also identified as new to myself, the data, and also new to the participants, particularly when it comes to mobile Android and iOS-based programs like Google Maps, Lazarello GPS for the blind, and also Be My Eyes. Unfortunately, out of the 28 visually impaired participants, only 12 of them ever made mention of either hearing of these applications or having used these applications. Some of the reasons why they indicated for not using these applications on a regular basis was the fact that these applications sometimes give them wrong location simply because they work with GPS. And so during cloudy weather conditions or sometimes unpredictable environmental factors, they tend to miss their destination, making it more difficult for them to resort to these mobile technology devices. Sometimes, in the case of Lazarello and Be My Eyes, they usually rely on internet connectivity to work. And so with our unreliable nature of our internet services, they also made it more difficult for them to rely on them in also navigating their way. And the last reason why these mobile technology did not seem to be preferred among the disability community was the fact that they virtually had to overly concentrate on the mobile phone throughout the journey. And this usually deprived them of crucial or some sensational moments that might have been enjoyed if they had not necessarily focused on the phone whilst they travel from point A to point B. And so it brings to bear the issue of moving beyond the responsibility of allowing the visually impaired to make it their own, decision in ensuring an appreciation of their geographical area, and also moving the discussion beyond on how we can ensure we provide the needed services to make it easier for visually impaired to travel from one point to the other. Among all of these concerns, the attitude of transport operators appear to be the most significant factor influencing the ability of PWDs to travel on public transport services. And in this case, participants were more vocal, and I had more issues coming up as seen in the code metrics browser, indicating the extent to which various interactions with transport operators has significantly made it more difficult for them to enjoy our transport services as compared to other people. And here I'm going to disaggregate the discussion based on views from the visually impaired and views from the physically challenged. So I'm starting off with the visually impaired. One of the key things that actually made it difficult for the visually impaired to enjoy our transport services had to do with skepticism on the ability of visually impaired to travel independently. And so for some transport operators, they actually had doubt whether or not these visually impaired participants will be able to find their way home when they had alighted from their buses. So the worry of escaping the reality of not being questioned, of not being held responsible for someone getting lost or someone not finding his way home, accounted for one of the key reasons why some transport operators used visual impairment as a basis to prevent participants from actually getting on board. For other instances, some other transport operators used the visual impairment as a basis to either cheat participants in making them pay more for transport services or actually under declaring the value of a currency note. So for instance, if they hand over a 10 CD note expecting maybe a 7 CD change in return, what might come in return could be a 5 CD note or even lesser, knowing very well that these visually impaired participants will not be in a position to accurately determine the value of the currency note that will be returned as change for whatever amount that was paid for. Other attitudes that were experienced by visually impaired participants in relation to the attitude of transport operators had to do with abrupt change of predetermined routes without necessarily consulting visually impaired to find out whether it will be to their favor or otherwise. In other cases, deliberate attempt to miss PWD's destination, particularly when there is competition among transport operators for potential customers or potential passengers. So when it happens like that, it was more easily and frequently that transport operators will miss their location, knowing very well they will actually lose out to other passengers if they decide to adhere to their request to alight at a point or another. Then the next issue had to do with simple refusal of transport operators to offer some support services. And so when they alight from the buses, support services in helping them to either cross the street or look for another vehicle to their next location. The contract was that their mission was to get them to point A or point B. And once they get there, how they manage their way to cross the street or even find another vehicle to continue their journey was simply out of the interest of these transport operators. And so these services were not requested as they hoped for. For the physically challenged, on the other hand, particularly the case of the wheelchair, constant requests from transport operators to facilitate the entry of wheelchair users into the buses and exits also made them unattractive clients, for simple reasons being that the strenuous efforts required in helping wheelchair users to move into the bus and exit, and the copious amount of time that are also required to do these exercises made them unattractive to them because they felt they would have actually used that time to look for prospective passengers to actually hop on board and would have actually drained them of the required energy that would be needed to make the journey. And so for that matter, a lot of wheelchair users cited many instances of transport operators refusing to allow them join their buses. Other instances also include poor human relation resulting from this. And there were instances where wheelchair users were actually receiving insults or being blamed by transport operators as wasting their time and also making it more difficult for them to meet their daily sales target, making it more difficult for them to actually enjoy the services when compared to the general population who do not get to receive all of these insults and all of these tantrums that were thrown at them. Now, once we looked at the issue of attitude, let me say that our transport services in Ghana always require two people as operators. So we always have the driver who will always operate the vehicle and the conductor who will always engage with passengers from one time to the other. But when participants were asked to generally rate the conduct of the drivers and their conductors, surprisingly, the drivers had a lower average rating than the conductors, signifying that the drivers, on the other hand, were deemed to be more hostile to transport to PWDs as compared to the driver. And I found this to be interesting. Upon further interaction, I realized that to most PWDs, the conductors were under the control or supervision of the drivers. And so even though they received a lot more insults from these conductors, they perceived the conductors to be under the supervision of the driver. So if the conductors were hostile, it is just a reflection of the driver's approval or the driver's permission or explicit permission to show hostility towards PWDs when they are actually enjoying these services. And that is why the drivers actually recorded lower rating when it came to good behavior than the conductors. So what am I saying? I am saying that the transport provision of transport services in Ghana, but using Accra as a steady focus, is just a matter of business as usual. And for that matter, we may have to start thinking of these things and how to overhaul our transport services to make it more accommodating to PWDs, knowing very well everyone in the general population can easily fall within the disability bracket. Secondly, the unresponsiveness of our transport services, as seen in the study, was largely seen in the poor condition of our transport services, knowing very well that most of the transport services were in sharp contradiction of the various dictates of our Disability Act. No ramp, high floor heights, no priority seats for PWDs, and etc. But among all of these things, human interaction appeared to be the most dominant contributing factor that hinders the enjoyment of PWDs, and perhaps an opportunity for us to start a national engagement on how to start a massive disability education and reorient ourselves about the role of PWDs in also seeing themselves as valuable members of society. And so on this note, I bring my presentation to an end. These are synopses and pictures taken from the field showing various interactions I had with various members of the disability population and various activities we also engage ourselves in. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll take the room to take comments and suggestions from the audience.